Montana Territory, early spring of 1881. The wind cut low across the prairie, carrying the last bite of winter even though the snow was starting to melt in patches. On the edge of the Bitterroot Mountains, a wagon creaked along a muddy trail, the sun setting behind it in a wash of gold and copper. Inside the wagon sat two little girls wrapped in threadbare quilts, their faces smudged with dust and fear. And staggering beside the wagon, gripping the reins with white knuckles, was Aven Mayfield. She was 26, widowed and bone-tired. Her hands were cracked, her dress torn at the hem, and her heart so worn she thought it might never beat right again. But her daughters Clara, 6, and Celie, 4 were still breathing, and that was reason enough to keep walking. They had been abandoned 3 days ago, when the man Aven had paid to take them to her uncle's land in Helena turned out to be nothing more than a liar with a whip and a whiskey problem. He had taken the money and left them in the middle of nowhere, near a burned-out homestead and a stream that barely trickled. She had no map, no supplies, and no choice but to follow the sun west and hope for a miracle. That miracle came in the form of a man on horseback. He crested the ridge like a shadow, backlit by the dying light, his coat flapping against the horse's sides. He saw the wagon, saw her mud up to her knees, shoulders heaving from pulling it through the slush, and without a word he turned his horse down the slope. She tensed. Her girls went quiet. He stopped a few feet away, dismounted, and raised both hands slowly. "I am not here to hurt you," he said, voice low and steady. "You look like you need help." Aven stepped in front of her daughters. "Who are you?" "Yates Zimmerman," he said, eyes scanning the wagon, the girls, the broken axle. "I ranch a few miles from here. You are about a day's walk from anything useful. Maybe more. Then I will keep walking," she said, though her legs were shaking. "You will not make it through the night out here with children. Let me help." Aven stared at him for a long moment. His hair was too long, his coat patched, and his boots were caked in mud, but there was something in his face. Not pity, she could not stomach pity, but caution. Like he had been hurt too and knew the shape of it. She nodded once. Yates moved with quiet efficiency. He lifted Clara into the saddle, then Celie, then helped Aven up behind them. He tied the wagon off to his horse and led them down the ridge, his shoulders broad under the dusk. Aven kept her arms tight around her daughters, but her eyes stayed on the man walking ahead of them. They reached his ranch near dark, a modest place built into the edge of a hill with a barn, a paddock, and smoke curling from the chimney. He brought them inside, lit a lamp, and stepped aside. "You are safe here. I live alone. You can rest tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out where you need to go." Aven's knees buckled the second she saw the bed. She caught herself against the wall and whispered, "Thank you." He turned to fetch water, giving her space. That night, Clara and Celie curled up in the bed with full bellies and clean faces. Aven sat by the hearth, staring into the fire. Yates sat across from her, his hat in his lap. "You said you were headed to Helena? My uncle has land out there." "I thought," her voice cracked. "I thought if I could get there, we might have a chance." "And the man driving the wagon? Gone." Yates nodded slowly. "You are lucky to be alive." "I do not feel lucky. You are still breathing. That is something." She looked at him. He had a scar along his throat, pale and jagged, half hidden by his collar. He caught her glance and said nothing. In the days that followed, Yates made no demands. He let Aven take the girls outside into the pasture, helped her boil water for washing, and gave her space to breathe. He fixed the wagon without being asked. He mended the axle, replaced the broken boards, and brought her a map. "You are still set on going?" Aven folded the corner of the map, thinking, "I have to do what is right for them." He nodded. "Of course." But that night, Clara tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Do we have to leave yet?" Aven brushed hair from her daughter's face. "Why? I like it here. Mr. Yates is nice." Aven tucked the quilt around them tighter. She did not have an answer. On the 5th day, a storm rolled in fast snow and wind and ice, and they were trapped at the ranch. Yates chopped extra wood, brought the animals into the barn, and set up cots for the girls near the fire. That night, Aven found him in the barn brushing down his horse. His sleeves were rolled up, arms streaked with mud and hay. You did not have to take us in. He did not look at her. Maybe not. Why did you? Because I know what it feels like to be left behind. She stepped toward him. You lost someone? My wife. 10 years ago. Fever took her and the baby both. I never tried again. Aven swallowed hard. I am sorry. He met her eyes then. You are the first person I have spoken to this much in years. Something shifted between them. A quiet understanding. Back inside, she found herself watching him more. The way he crouched to talk to Celie, or how he fixed Clara's doll with twine and a button. He never asked for thanks. He never tried to take anything from her. One evening, as the storm howled outside, Aven handed him a mug of coffee and sat beside him on the floor. You have been good to us. I wanted to be. Why? He looked at her, long and searching. Because you were brave. Because you did not give up. Because you remind me what it feels like to care about someone again. Her breath caught. Yates reached out slowly like he was afraid to scare her. His fingers brushed hers. She did not pull away. That night, after the girls were asleep, she stayed by the fire a little longer. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching, and when he looked at her, she let him. You should sleep, he said. I do not want to be alone tonight. He took her hand, just held it, and said, then you will not be. And for the first time in years, Aven slept without fear. By the time the snow began to melt off the trees and the trail leading to Yates's ranch turned from white hush to brown slush, Aven had begun to understand the rhythm of the place. The land didn't give its secrets all at once. Neither did the man who worked it. But both had a kind of quiet honesty she had not known she needed. Yates rose before sunrise, always. Never with noise. He moved through the house like he belonged to it, measured, deliberate. In the mornings, Aven would hear the scrape of his boots on the porch as he stepped out to see to the animals. She never rose in time to catch him leaving, only found the fire already stoked, a kettle warming, and Clara humming softly to herself, seated cross-legged with a wooden spoon and a chipped bowl Yates had let her call her own. Celie, slower to wake, clung to sleep the way only the very young can afford to, her cheek pressed to Aven's side until the scent of biscuits or the sound of the barn door swinging open drew her up. On the 6th morning after the storm passed, Aven stepped outside before the girls stirred. The air was damp and heavy with pine. She stood on the porch in her boots, arms crossed, watching the sun climb over the eastern slope. Yates was in the paddock mending a fence post that had splintered under the weight of wind and snow. Instead of calling to him, she walked down, boots squelching in the thawed earth. He glanced up only once, then returned to his work. She picked up the second hammer leaning against the fence rail. He didn't stop her. Just nodded. They worked in silence for a while, side by side. Her blows were clumsy at first, but she steadied. He didn't correct her. Didn't hover. When they paused, he offered her the canteen without speaking. She drank, wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, and passed it back. My uncle, she said quietly, used to let me help with the mules sometimes. Before he sent me east. Yates looked over. You didn't grow up out here? No. Pennsylvania. Rail town. My mother died in childbirth. My uncle was the only kin left. Said I needed a husband more than I needed a loom. So he arranged a match. He waited. I never met the man. A dry goods clerk in Miles City. Corresponded through his cousin. We were to marry on arrival. I brought my best dress. But when I stepped off the coach, he took one look and said I'd be no good. Too quiet, he said. No life in me. Yates's jaw shifted slightly. Not a word passed. I didn't argue. Her voice was steady. Didn't know how. I just climbed back aboard and started asking around. Found a man willing to take me toward Helena. Thought I could find work and send for the girls later. You didn't trust the man. I didn't trust myself. Yates turned back to the post. Struck a nail clean through with one hit. He was a fool. She didn't answer. Later, over midday bread and boiled eggs, Clara told Yates about a dream she'd had something with geese and a river that ran backward. He listened as if she were telling him a sermon. Celie, not to be outdone, climbed into his lap and whispered that she wanted a pony. He didn't promise her one, just chuckled quietly and said, That's a mighty big wish. After the girls were down for their nap, Aven found him on the porch, his chair tipped back, hat over his eyes. She sat beside him without asking. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked after a while. He didn't move. "Used to. After my wife passed, I thought about selling up. Headed as far south as the money would take me." "What stopped you?" "Didn't know how to quit." Aven folded her hands in her lap. "I tried to make myself smaller. All my life. Thought if I just stayed quiet enough, I'd be safe." Yates lowered his hat, met her gaze. "You brought 2 children through the mountains in near winter. Pulled a broken wagon through mud. That's not small." She looked away. Her hands were shaking, but she didn't hide them. That night, Aven sat by the hearth after the girls were asleep. Yates came in from the barn, coat dusted with straw. He poured himself a bit of whiskey and sat across from her. She watched the firelight flicker over the scar along his throat. "Do people ever ask how you got it?" "Sometimes." She waited. He took a sip before answering. "My neighbor's bull got loose. I was trying to bring him down before he reached the creek. Slipped, landed wrong. Horn caught me under the chin." She exhaled, slow. "I thought maybe it was a knife." He shook his head. "Not every wound is from a fight." They sat in silence, the kind that didn't press or prod. The next day, Yates brought in a box from the loft. "Used to belong to my wife. Some things she left behind. Thought the girls might like them." Inside were scraps of lace, a spindle, a set of carved wooden animals, and a slim book of hymns with pages so thin they rustled like dry leaves. Clara took to the wooden fox, Celie to the lace. Aven held the book in her lap for a long time before speaking. "She must have been kind." He nodded. "She was. But she wasn't you." Aven's eyes lifted. "She was better with words than I am," he said. "But I've come to see that quiet doesn't mean empty." That evening, Aven asked if she could help with supper. Together, they peeled potatoes and sliced onions. She didn't flinch when their hands brushed. He didn't pull away. After the meal, Clara asked if they could stay a little longer. "Just until the mud dried." Aven looked to Yates. He didn't reply right away, just dropped another log onto the fire and said, "You're welcome as long as you need." The next morning, Aven rose early. She found a needle and thread from the sewing tin and began mending the curtain in the girls' sleeping nook. Yates passed by on his way out, stopped, and said, "I was thinking. There's a family down the ridge. The Halsteads. They raise sheep. The wife's been needing help since her sister took ill. I could ask if they'd speak with you." Aven nodded. "I'd appreciate that." He paused at the door. "But I'd rather you stay." She looked up. "I know you didn't come here looking for another man. But I've seen the way you hold your daughters when they're scared. I've seen how you don't wait to be told what needs doing. You've got more strength than most men I know, and I'd be proud to build a life with someone like you." Aven stood slowly. "You barely know me. I know what matters." She crossed the room, stopped a breath away. "And what is that?" "That when I wake, I hope to hear your voice. That when I think of the future, I picture your girls running through the pasture. That when I watch you sew, I feel like the house is full again." Her eyes welled, but no tears fell. "I'm not asking today," he said. "But I'm not going anywhere." She reached out, took his hand. "I'm tired of running," she whispered. "Then stay." She nodded once. And later, when dusk came and the girls curled against the quilts, Aven walked outside. Yates was leaning against the fence, watching the stars blink into the sky. She stepped beside him, rested her head against his shoulder. "I want to try," she said. His arm came around her back, steady and sure. "I'll build a second bed," he said. "We'll need a bigger table." He smiled, quiet and warm. And in the soft dark of the Montana spring, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of promise. The first rains of April came gentle and steady, turning the rutted soil of the lower pasture into thick clay. The roof of the house held firm, though Aven still placed a bucket in the back corner near the stove, just in case. Yates had mentioned the flashing needed replacing before summer thunder rolled in, and she'd quietly made a note to stitch him a waxed canvas apron from the feed sackcloth stored in the barn. By then, a rhythm had settled between them, not the raw survival she'd arrived with, but something quieter, steadier. Yates no longer asked if she needed anything. He simply made room. Some mornings he left an extra biscuit wrapped in cloth on the table for her. On others she left a folded shirt she'd mended on his chair, the missing button replaced with one of soft bone from the sewing tin. It was Clara who noticed first. "Ma," she whispered one night, curled against her side beneath the quilt. "Mr. Yates looked at you different today. Like when the sun comes out after it rains." Aven kissed her brow and said nothing. But in the hush of the house, she lay awake long after the girls had nodded off, listening to the rhythm of Yates's footsteps on the porch boards as he checked the sky one last time before bed. The next morning, she rose early and found him in the lean-to, oiling the hinges of the barn door. She stood for a moment in the doorway, then stepped inside, her hands tucked into her apron. "There's a school in town," she said. "A small one. One of the Halstead girls mentioned it when she came by with nettle tea." Yates looked up, his fingers still on the oiling cloth. "They only have a teacher 3 days a week," Aven continued, "but it's steady. They said she's near to marrying and might not return come fall." Yates nodded once, waiting. "I used to read to the boys back east. At the mill. When their fathers were working late and their mothers were too worn out to sit by the fire." "You thinking of taking it?" "If they'll have me." He set the cloth down, wiped his hands on the edge of his trousers. "You'd do well at it. I've never taught formally." "You've taught your girls." She hesitated. "It wouldn't be every day. I'd still have time here." His gaze didn't leave hers. "I never doubted that." Later that week, she rode into town with him for the first time. Clara and Celie stayed behind with Mrs. Halstead, who'd taken a liking to them and had a brood of her own to keep them busy. Aven had never ridden astride before, but Yates had offered the mule with the gentle back and walked the whole way beside her. The town of Westbridge wasn't more than a few clustered buildings, 2 supply stores, a post office, a smithy, and a meeting hall that doubled as a schoolhouse. The streets were still slick from rain, and her boots soaked through the moment she stepped down, but she didn't complain. Yates walked beside her, shoulders squared, not saying much but glancing her way now and again like he wasn't sure whether to speak or just keep pace. Inside the school, the teacher, a red-haired woman with a voice like cracked corn, looked Aven over from behind a desk made from mismatched planks. "You're the one from Zimmerman's place?" "I am." "You know your letters?" "Yes, ma'am. And sums. I can recite full passages from the good book and have a fair memory for geography." The woman leaned back. "I'm leaving come harvest. If you're willing to help now and take over, then it'd save the committee from hunting someone out of Missoula." Aven nodded slowly. "I'll need to bring my daughters with me." "They sit quiet?" "They do." "Then you can start next week." Back outside, Yates waited near the store, holding 2 sacks of grain. When Aven approached, she didn't say anything at first, just touched the edge of his sleeve and nodded once. He didn't smile, but his eyes lit. On the ride home, the wind picked up, tugging at her bonnet. She reached up to adjust it, and Yates slowed beside her. "You afraid?" "Of what?" "Starting something new." She looked out over the fields, the way the grasses bent low and the sky stretched wide enough to make her feel small. "I used to be." That evening, when Clara and Celie ran to meet them at the edge of the fence, Aven lifted both girls down from the saddle herself. She kissed their cheeks and told them gently about the school, about the children they'd meet and the books they'd read. Celie asked if there'd be pie. Clara asked if they'd be allowed to wear their Sunday dresses. Yates stood back, watching, his arms loosely crossed. 2 days later, while Aven was hanging linens behind the barn, she found something tucked beneath the basket, a small wooden box, hand-carved, with a lid that fit snug. Inside, folded neatly, was a sheet of stationery and a pencil shaved down to the nub. Aven turned it over in her hands, then looked up. Yates stood near the barn door, not close but not far either. "I thought maybe you might want to write your uncle," he said. She blinked once, then again. "I don't expect anything," he said. "But if he's still alive, he ought to know you made it." She held the box close to her chest. "Thank you. I'll take it to town when you're ready." That night, she wrote by firelight. Not a long letter. Just enough to tell her uncle that she and the girls were safe, that the land was kind, and that she hoped he'd write if he could. She didn't mention Yates by name, but she wrote of the ranch, of the quiet man who had offered shelter without asking for anything in return. She left the letter unsealed on the table. In the morning it was gone, and in its place was a second pencil. The days grew longer. Aven began walking the girls to the schoolhouse on the days she taught, their little boots crunching over dry grass and the last of the thawed pine cones. Yates insisted on seeing them off each morning but never fussed. He only tipped his hat and said he'd have supper waiting. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed and the school ledgers were closed for the week, Aven sat out back, watching the last light slip behind the hills. Yates joined her, sitting beside her on the bench without a word. After a while, she turned to him. "I think this is the first place I've ever felt like I belonged." He didn't answer right away, just reached over and took her hand. "I'd like to build something," she said, voice quiet. "Not just for the girls. For you. For us." His thumb brushed her knuckles. "I've been waiting to hear that." She leaned into his shoulder, and he rested his cheek against her hair. The world was still, save for the distant call of a night bird and the wind in the high branches. Nothing more needed saying. The wind shifted in early May. It no longer carried the raw bite of mountain cold, but a softened edge, scented with damp grass and the faintest trace of wild plum from the thickets near the creek. The thawed earth gave underfoot now, loamy and rich from snowmelt, and the pasture behind the house had begun to green in earnest, dotted here and there with the first stubborn dandelions. Aven stood at the edge of the pasture one morning, sleeves pinned up past her elbows, rake in hand. She'd cleared most of the winter's deadfall from the vegetable plot behind the barn, and her palms were tacky with blisters that split slightly when she gripped too tight. Still, she didn't stop. Clara and Celie were down by the stream under Mrs. Halstead's watch, and the hush of the late morning gave her space to think. Yates had ridden out early to check the cattle up the ridge. He'd left a note, brief and scrawled on the corner of a feed ledger, weighed down with a smooth stone on the table. He'd never done that before. She read it twice before pocketing it. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow slipping over the field like a whisper. Aven paused, adjusting the bandana at her throat, and turned toward the house. She hadn't intended to stay out as long as she had, but the air was sweet and the quiet felt earned. Inside, she poured herself a tin cup of water from the crock and set it on the table. The kitchen window was open, and a honeybee hovered near the sill, drunk on the warmth. She didn't shoo it away. Instead, she pulled out the writing box Yates had given her and opened it slowly. Her uncle's reply had arrived 3 days ago, a single page in a careful, slanted hand. He'd written from a small settlement north of Helena where he'd taken work as a millwright after a fire had claimed most of his livestock the previous year. He asked after the girls, mentioned he was glad she had found safety, and said little else. No invitation. No reproach. Just a closed sentence, "May the Lord look kindly on your path." She folded the letter back into its envelope and tucked it beneath the lining of the box. The front door opened just as she was wiping her hands on a rag. Yates stepped inside, dust thick on his coat and a line of sweat at his collar. "Fence is holding, but one of the calves has a limp," he said, setting his hat on the peg. "Think it's a strain, not a break." She poured him a fresh cup and set it near the stove. He drank half of it in one go. "Anything from the creek?" she asked. "Tracks near the far bank. Not deep enough to say for sure, but I'd wager a cat's been sniffing around." She nodded, already mentally noting which tools were still sharp enough to hang near the pen. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "I passed Mr. Gossman on the way down. Says they're sending a circuit preacher through at month's end. Holding service near the old river bend." Aven met his gaze. "You thinking of going?" "Not much use I've had for sermons lately, but I reckon it wouldn't hurt to hear a little scripture out in the sun." She hesitated. "You think it would be proper to go together?" He stepped forward, not abrupt, but with purpose. "I think folks already see us as one household." Her voice was softer. "And do you?" "I see you here," he said, "every day. I see the way you walk the land like it's already yours." She swallowed. "I don't want the girls to feel like we're waiting on something that's never coming." He didn't reach for her, but there was weight in his stillness. "Then let's stop waiting." It wasn't a proposal, not in the formal sense. No rings, no knee bent in dust. Just two people standing in a kitchen made warm by use, with peeled potatoes in a bowl and a rag drying on the line. But she understood it for what it was. And she nodded. They spoke to the Halsteads first. Mrs. Halstead's eyebrows rose in approval, and her husband merely grunted and tightened the buckle on his suspenders. "Reckon it's about time," he said, and offered his hand. Yates sent a letter with the next passing stage to the preacher requesting a blessing be read at the river service. They didn't need papers, not with neighbors as witness and land as their bond. The girls were told gently, and Clara beamed so wide her cheeks ached. Celie asked if she could wear flowers in her hair. On the morning of the gathering, Aven rose before dawn and lit the fire before anyone else stirred. She washed her face with water cold from the basin and pinned her hair in a new way, pulling it back with a ribbon she hadn't worn since leaving Pennsylvania. It wasn't white. It didn't need to be. It was soft blue, and it matched the sky outside the window. Yates came in from the barn with his shirt pressed and his hair still damp from the pump. He watched her for a moment, then reached into his coat and pulled out a small sprig of wild plum, the petals barely opened. "Found it near the creek," he said. "Didn't seem right to leave it." She took it, fingers brushing his. "Thank you." They walked the path together, the girls skipping ahead in dresses Aven had let them choose from the Halsteads' hand-me-down basket. The preacher stood beneath the juniper, his voice carrying clear over the field as he read from the Book of Ruth. The congregation was sparse, maybe 20 souls, but every face was familiar now. Familiar and kind. When the final words were spoken and the blessing given, Yates took her hand and didn't let go. They didn't kiss in front of the crowd. That came later, when the girls were chasing beetles under a patch of thistle and the air had grown golden with late light. He pulled her gently behind the barn where the fence cast long shadows and the scent of crushed clover rose underfoot. "I meant it," he said. "Every part of it." She cupped his jaw, feeling the rough line of his stubble beneath her thumb. "So did I." When their lips met, it wasn't rushed or tentative. It was steady, like everything they'd built, weeks and weeks of quiet glances, of shared labor, of seeing and being seen. That night, the house was full of soft sounds, the girls whispering secrets beneath their quilts, the kettle hissing gently on the stove, the creak of floorboards as Yates checked the latch on the side door. Aven stood at the hearth, brushing her fingers over the carved wooden fox Clara had left on the shelf. He came behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "You tired?" he asked. "No," she said, leaning into him. "Not anymore." They didn't speak again as they climbed the stairs. The wind outside had calmed, and a stillness settled over the ranch, not empty, but complete. In the quiet dark, Aven listened to his breathing beside her. Each inhale, each exhale, steady and real. The rhythm of a man who had waited long enough and a woman who had finally stopped running. She closed her eyes and let herself rest. Not because she had no more to do, but because, for the first time, she didn't have to do it all alone. The wheatgrass had grown high enough to whisper against the girls' knees when they chased each other through the pasture. Skirts catching on seed heads, hair tangled with wind. Aven stood on the porch, arms folded beneath her apron, watching them. The sky was the color of cooled iron, with a warm wind pressing in from the south. She could smell rain, though it had yet to fall. Behind her, the screen door creaked as Yates stepped out, drying his hands on a cloth he'd tied to his belt. "South fence'll need mending by week's end," he said. "We can do it tomorrow," Aven replied. "School's out for the holiday. Clara promised to help if I let her pick supper." He studied the horizon. "That girl could talk a bear into a dance." "She gets that from her father," Aven said quietly, not looking at him. Yates didn't answer right away. He stepped down from the porch and stood beside her, eyes still on the field. "You ever talk about him? To the girls? When they ask?" Clara remembers a little. Celie not at all. "You afraid it'll confuse them?" "You and me." She turned, leaning a hip against the post. "No. I'm afraid they'll forget he was good." "They won't." "Not if you keep remembering for them." She let that settle. "You're going to be a good man in their story too." He didn't answer, just reached for her hand. She gave it, and they stood together until the clouds thickened and the girls came running back, cheeks flushed, palms sticky with wild strawberries. By late June, the ranch had shifted into summer's rhythm. The schoolhouse was shuttered for 2 months. The garden rose had taken root, and the days stretched long and hot. Aven had begun waking early again, before even the birds, to walk the pasture barefoot and alone. Not for need, but for stillness. Her life no longer ran on fear or scarcity, and she found herself craving quiet in a way she hadn't known before. Yates noticed. One morning, he joined her without speaking, falling into step beside her as they made their way past the fence line. The grass was heavy with dew, and neither of them wore shoes. They walked until the house was a shape behind them and the creak sound carried sharp against the hush. "I was thinking," he said finally, "come fall, we might add a second coop. Sell off some eggs to the dry goods. You want to take on more hens? Only if you don't mind the noise." She smiled. "I don't mind anything with feathers, long as it doesn't sleep inside." He glanced at her sidelong. "You ever think about what you want? Not just what needs doing." Aven stopped walking. "I've never had room to think that far." "You do now." She looked up at the slope of the mountain beyond the creek, the way the clouds hung low like they were resting after a long journey. "I want a place for the girls to read without squinting. A window in the loft. I want to learn how to make bread that doesn't need drowning in honey to be edible." Yates grinned, slow and quiet. "It's not that bad." She lifted an eyebrow. The last one cracked the plate. "I can build the window. I'll keep trying the bread." They started walking again, hands brushing once, then again, until his fingers closed around hers. The second coop went up in July. Clara painted a crooked white star on the side, and Celie insisted on naming each hen after flowers. Aven watched them grow brown with sun and laughter, and felt something settle in her chest that had never quite found its place before. One evening, Yates came in from the barn with a paper-wrapped bundle. He set it on the table and unwrapped it slowly, revealing a bolt of calico pale yellow, with small white blossoms. "What's this?" Aven asked, brushing the fabric with her fingers. "Mrs. Halstead said it came on the last freight wagon. Thought you might like something that's just yours." She stared at it, heart thudding. "You didn't have to." "I know. That's why I did." She lifted the cloth, held it to her cheek. "It's too fine for working." "Then don't wear it for work." "You want me standing idle then?" He stepped closer, voice low. "No. I want you to have something soft. Something you didn't have to earn." Aven folded the fabric carefully and set it aside. "I'll make a dress. For the harvest dance." Yates blinked. "There's a dance." "There will be." She kept her word. Over the next weeks, she worked the fabric after supper, her stitches small and even, the thread steady beneath her fingers. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The joy wasn't in the wearing. It was in the making. The dance came at the end of August. The schoolhouse was swept clean, lanterns hung from the rafters, and fiddles brought in from 2 counties over. Aven wore the yellow dress with her hair pinned up, and Clara and Celie wore matching ribbons Yates had brought back from the store without being asked. They danced until the lanterns burned low. Yates didn't speak much, but he kept his hand at the small of her back and his eyes on hers until the rest of the room faded. Later, walking back under stars that shimmered like frost, he pulled her close. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said. "You didn't," she replied. "You have something new." In the weeks that followed, the air turned dry and crisp. The garden gave up its last tomatoes, and the girls began helping Aven shell beans on the porch in the evenings. The window in the loft was finished, facing east, and Aven hung a scrap of lace over it not to block the sun, but to catch it. One morning, as she stood by the stove, Celie tugged at her apron. "Are we staying forever?" Aven knelt. "Why do you ask?" "Because I don't want to leave. Not even for a little while." She gathered her daughter into her arms. "We're not leaving. This is our home." That night, she told Yates what Celie had said. He didn't answer, just reached over and took her hand across the table. "I was going to wait," he said, "but I think you already know." She tilted her head. "No, what?" He slid a small box across the table. Inside was a ring simple silver with a polished stone the color of river slate. I asked the smith in town. He said it's from the mountains. I wanted something made of this place. Aven touched the ring, then looked up at him. You're certain? I've never been more. She slipped it on. It fit without force. The wedding came without fanfare. Just the girls, the Halsteads, and the preacher who'd married them by the river. It was quiet, held in the pasture under the same tree where Aven first watched Clara chase butterflies in her stockinged feet. This time, Clara held a small bouquet of sage and lavender, and Celie stood proudly beside her in a new dress that didn't quite reach her ankles. They spoke their vows in plain words with hands joined and eyes steady. There was no music, no feast, but when Yates kissed her, the girls clapped and the wind lifted the edge of her veil like the land itself was giving its blessing. That night, they stood together by the fence, watching the moon rise over the ridge. You think we'll ever leave this place? Aven asked, voice soft. Yates pulled her close. Only if the land asks us to. I don't think it will. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Then we'll grow old right here. And they did. The years were not all easy. The first winter brought a sickness that swept through the cattle, and Yates spent 3 nights in the barn nursing the sick calf back from the edge. Aven's teaching grew to 3 full days a week as new families settled nearby, and she taught each child as if they were her own. Clara grew tall and sharp-eyed, and Celie developed a fondness for sketching birds in the margins of her schoolwork. They built a second room onto the house, then a third. The coop expanded, and a dog showed up one spring and never left. They named him Ash for the color of his coat. He slept beneath their bed and followed the girls like a shadow. Through it all, Aven and Yates remained steady. They fought, sometimes about fence lines, about late suppers, about whether or not to sell the roan mare, but their arguments always ended the same way, hands finding each other, eyes softening, silence giving way to understanding. They never spoke again of the lives they'd left behind. Not because they forgot, but because they no longer needed to carry them. And on clear nights, when the wind was gentle and the house quiet, Aven would sit on the porch beside Yates, her head resting against his shoulder, and say nothing at all. Because peace, once earned, does not ask for words. Only presence. Only love.